Flight attendant kicks off elderly lady, weeps when she learns it's the CEO's mum. Welcome to today's riveting story, one that dives into how a single misstep can cost far more than anyone ever imagined. Our tale begins with a flight attendant who makes a gravely misguided decision to remove an elderly passenger from the plane. Little does she know, her rash action will spark a chain of events that shakes the entire airline industry. Layer by layer, prejudices unravel, and a deep secret surfaces that lands this flight attendant in tears and jeopardizes her entire career. Hold on tight for unexpected twists, swift doses of karma, and a climactic revelation that no one, least of all the flight attendant, ever saw coming. Before we dive in, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. If you're excited about this story, let us know. If you enjoyed the video, press 1. If not, press O. Your feedback really inspires me to gather more uplifting and meaningful stories. The early morning sun glimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, illuminating the bustling concourse with a warm glow. Passengers rolled suitcases across polished floors, scanning flight boards and rushing to gates. Among them stood Tanya, a flight attendant in her freshly ironed uniform, hair pinned neatly in a low bun. She checked her watch incessantly, poised to begin boarding for flight 764 bound for Seattle. With 8 years of experience at Horizon Skies Airlines, Tanya was proud of her track record: on-time flights, thorough compliance with regulations, and a reputation for being strict but efficient. Yet beneath the professional veneer, a streak of impatience often surfaced whenever she felt passengers disrupted her orderly routine. Tanya's morning had started poorly. Her car tire was flat, forcing her to scramble for a rideshare. Then, an unexpected security delay had forced her to sprint through the terminal. By the time she reached the gate, she was breathless, nerves on edge. She tried to collect herself, smoothing her uniform and forcing a professional smile. Pre-boarding began, and she inspected each passenger's ticket with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times. She noticed a late addition, an older woman with silver curls, leaning on a cane. The moment the woman approached, Tanya's gut twisted with annoyance. The passenger looked sweet enough, but older individuals often needed extra assistance, time, and effort. Tanya felt she could ill afford that morning. "Good morning, ma'am," Tanya said, glancing at the older woman's ticket. "Miss S. Caldwell, seat 21C. Right down the aisle to the left." The older woman, her name was Mildred Caldwell, smiled kindly. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice soft and pleasant. Tanya nodded, maintaining polite detachment as Mildred passed by. The flight attendant observed how the woman's shoulders trembled just slightly under the weight of a heavy tote bag. Tanya almost considered offering to carry it, but was distracted by a sudden announcement from the gate agent about overhead bin constraints. By the time Tanya turned back, Mildred was slowly shuffling down the jet bridge, cane tapping each step of the way. The plane quickly filled. The overhead bins were at capacity before the final group boarded. Tanya made repeated announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of overhead space. Please consider checking your larger items." Though it was standard procedure, tensions rose when a few passengers argued about needing their bags in the cabin. Through all this chaos, Mildred sat quietly in her seat, gazing out the window. Tanya's co-worker, a junior flight attendant named Janelle, walked the cabin helping stow last-minute bags. Upon reaching seat 21C, Janelle noticed Mildred's bag on the floor, and the older woman apologetically said, "I'd put it under the seat if I could, but my legs aren't what they used to be." Janelle crouched. "That's all right, ma'am. Let me see if we can rearrange something overhead." In the midst of helping her, Janelle accidentally tipped the bag. Out rolled a zippered pouch and what looked like a folded letter. Mildred quickly bent to pick it up, hand trembling. "Careful," she said, voice wavering with emotion. "That's something special from my son." Janelle offered a reassuring pat on Mildred's hand. "Not to worry. I'll keep it safe." Meanwhile, Tanya hovered nearby, glancing at the boarding clock. They were running behind schedule. She approached, not unkindly, but with the clipped impatience of someone under immense pressure. "Everything all right here, Janelle?" Janelle nodded. "Yes, just helping Miss S. Caldwell with her bag." Tanya put her hands on her hips. "We need to close the door soon, so let's get it stowed and proceed with takeoff procedures." Mildred offered a grateful smile to Janelle, but sensed Tanya's impatience. She tried to tuck her cane beneath the seat. Tanya stepped in. "Ma'am, that cane must be properly stowed for takeoff," she said, her tone brusque. "We can store it in the closet near the front if it doesn't fit." Mildred hesitated. Her cane was custom-made, gifted by her late husband, but she handed it over with a small nod. "All right, dear, but please handle it gently." Tanya took the cane and moved to the front, exhaling her frustrations. She reminded herself to remain composed. It would be a long flight. The aircraft door closed, and the jet pulled away from the gate. Tanya performed the safety demonstration. While Janelle's voice offered a friendly welcome over the intercom, Tanya's gestures were precise, but lacked warmth. Mildred watched politely, her hands folded in her lap. The plane ascended, and soon the seatbelt sign blinked off, indicating it was safe to move about. Tanya commenced the beverage service with Janelle, pushing a cart down the aisle. She neared row 21, anticipating Mildred might require something. "Would you like a drink, ma'am?" Tanya asked, trying to sound neutral. "Just water, please," Mildred replied. Tanya handed her a cup with minimal eye contact. Over the next hour, the flight seemed uneventful. Tanya settled into her routine, double-checking seatbelts, monitoring the galley. Occasionally, she glanced at Mildred, who dozed intermittently, head tilted against the seat back. Just when Tanya began to relax, a beep resonated, a call light from row 21. Tanya sighed and rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath. Approaching Mildred, she forced a smile. "Yes, ma'am?" Mildred looked pale, pressing a hand to her abdomen. "I'm sorry, dear, I feel a bit nauseated. Could I possibly have some ginger ale?" Tanya's patient snapped. In her mind, she pictured more delays, another special request. She tried to keep her voice calm, but couldn't fully mask her exasperation. "Mem, A.M. We have limited service items right now due to turbulence. We're expecting some rough air soon. I'll see if I can fetch you some ginger ale, but we can't be up and down the aisle every 5 minutes." Mildred's cheeks reddened. "I'm so sorry to be a bother. I just don't want to get sick." Tanya pursed her lips. "Fine. Stay put. I'll see what I can do." Without waiting for a response, Tanya marched back to the galley. Janelle intercepted Tanya. "What's wrong?" she asked. Noticing Tanya's curt demeanor, Tanya explained, rolling her eyes about Mildred's request. Janelle frowned. "Don't be so hard on her. She's older, she might really need that ginger ale to calm her stomach." Tanya folded her arms. I know. It's just, I have so many tasks. And if she ends up getting sick, we'll have a mess on our hands." Janelle scurried to retrieve a can of ginger ale, along with some crackers, offering to deliver it herself. But Tanya insisted she would do it, determined to maintain authority in her designated aisle. She grabbed the items, plastered on a half-smile, and returned to Mildred's seat. "Here you go," she said briskly. Mildred thanked her softly, sipping the drink with trembling hands. Shortly after the beverage service concluded, the captain announced moderate turbulence ahead. Flight attendants were ordered to secure the cabin. Tanya and Janelle hastened through the aisle, collecting loose items, ensuring seatbelts were fastened. Reaching Mildred, Tanya noticed the older woman clutching her stomach, eyes closed. Concern flickered across Tanya's face for a moment, but she forced it away. "Seatbelt on," she said bluntly, tapping Mildred's arm. Mildred complied, wincing at the sudden movement. Tanya hurried on, repeating the directive to other passengers. Moments later, the plane lurched with an abrupt drop, jostling everyone. Gasps filled the cabin. A few overhead bins popped open. Tanya's heart raced, adrenaline surging as she braced herself. When the turbulence finally eased, the captain lifted the seatbelt sign. Tanya and Janelle emerged to handle any aftermath, spilled drinks, passengers needing to use the lavatory. They reached row 21 to find Mildred looking faint. She pressed the flight attendant call button again. Tanya's tension soared. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, forcing out the words. Mildred swallowed. "I'm so sorry, dear. I feel very dizzy. Could you help me to the lavatory?" Tanya's eyes darted around. She had a cart to manage and dozens of tasks. She turned to Janelle, silently pleading. But Janelle was busy consoling a frightened child in row 19. Tanya sighed. "Okay, come on," she said, guiding Mildred up from her seat. She handed the older woman her cane, which Janelle had retrieved after turbulence. Mildred leaned on it, walking gingerly. The trip to the lavatory was slow, each step an effort for the trembling older woman. Tanya bit her lip, counting the seconds. She gently guided Mildred into the small lavatory. "I'll wait right here," she said, arms folded. Several minutes later, the door cracked open. Mildred emerged, eyes watery. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm not usually this much trouble." Tanya forced a thin smile. "It's all right. Just try to rest once we get you back." They shuffled back to seat 21C, where Mildred sank down, looking embarrassed. Tanya turned quickly, anxious to move on, but she couldn't deny a pang of guilt. After all, the older woman truly seemed unwell. By the final hour of the flight, calm had returned. The passengers settled in, some napping, others watching in-flight entertainment. Tanya attempted to push aside her frustration and focus on finishing the flight smoothly. She checked seatbelts one last time before preparing for descent. That's when she noticed Mildred rummaging in her tote bag, seemingly desperate for something. "Is everything okay?" Tanya asked, maintaining a professional tone. Mildred's voice quivered. "I can't find my phone. I had it earlier to message my son about picking me up at the airport, and now it's gone." She patted her pockets, rummaged through her bag again. Her eyes brimmed with tears. "My memory isn't perfect these days. I'm worried I left it in the terminal or dropped it." Tanya inhaled deeply. "Let me do a quick check around your seat." She scanned the floor, the seat pocket, even checked the overhead bin. Nothing. "It's not here," she said, shaking her head. "If you left it in the terminal, there's not much we can do." Mildred's lip trembled. "Oh dear. My son's number is in there. I was supposed to call him. Now he won't know where I am." Tanya sighed heavily, empathizing on some level, but still mindful of the ticking flight clock. "We'll be landing soon. Maybe you can find a payphone or ask someone to borrow a phone once we land." Mildred nodded glumly, murmuring thanks. Tanya patted her shoulder once, then resumed her duties. Finally, Flight 764 touched down in Seattle. Passengers unbuckled, retrieving bags from overhead bins. Tanya and Janelle stood by the exit door, reciting the usual farewell lines. Mildred was among the last to disembark, walking slowly. Tanya gave her a polite nod. "Safe travels, ma'am." Mildred paused, an almost pleading expression in her eyes. "Could you possibly help me find my connecting flight? My son told me he'd booked me through to San Francisco, but I can't recall the airline." "I'm sorry." Tanya glanced at the disembarkation time on her watch. "We have another flight to prep here. The ground staff can assist you at the arrivals desk." Mildred nodded, tears threatening to spill. She thanked Tanya softly and stepped into the jet bridge, leaning on her cane. 20 minutes later, while the cleaning crew freshened the cabin, Tanya supervised from the cockpit door. She overheard a gate agent outside talking on a walkie-talkie about an elderly passenger needing assistance. The agent sounded exasperated. Tanya surmised it had to be Mildred. Shrugging, she focused on checking seat backs and overhead compartments for items left behind. Suddenly, she noticed a sleek smartphone wedged between two seats in row 21. She pulled it out. The lock screen read, 6 missed calls from Mike. Tanya's stomach twisted. This must be Mildred's phone found too late. She debated returning it, but felt she had no time to track down the older woman now. Another flight needed boarding, and the phone was locked anyway. She might come back for it, Tanya told herself, setting it aside on a seat. As the next wave of passengers began to board for a new flight, Tanya heard a commotion at the jet bridge. She recognized Mildred's trembling voice. "That is my phone." The older woman sounded desperate. "I just need to retrieve it. My son is waiting for me." A gate supervisor, a middle-aged man named Randall, tried to calm her. "Ma'am, I can't just let you back on the plane. Let me see what can be done. You'll have to wait here." Tanya felt annoyance bubbling. The plane was almost fully boarded for the next journey, and the presence of a distressed passenger at the door spelled trouble. She marched over. "What's going on?" Mildred pointed to Tanya's hands where the phone rested. "That's mine!" she cried, tears pooling in her eyes. "Please, let me have it. My son is worried about me." Tanya glanced at the phone, exhaling. "Ma'am, you already left the aircraft, and we're boarding for another flight. You need to coordinate with Lost and Found or the gate staff." Mildred's face fell, but she stepped forward. "I understand, but can you please just hand it to me? I can show you a message from my son. It's my phone." Tanya tapped the screen, locked. "I can't unlock it, so how do I know it's really yours?" The old woman's eyes widened, stunned at the accusation. "I just told you it was near seat 21C, correct?" Randall, noticing the tension, leaned closer. "Tanya, if the phone is there and she's described it accurately, we can let her confirm ownership." Tanya huffed. She held out the device. "All right, ma'am, unlock it, please." Mildred took the phone with shaking hands, pressed her thumb on the sensor, and the screen opened. A photo of Mildred, with a young man in a sharp suit, appeared as the wallpaper. "That's my boy," she said softly, pointing to the man in the picture. Tanya's eyes flicked to the image. The man looked vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place him. Perhaps he was a celebrity, or maybe just someone who had an aura of authority. Before she could dwell on it, the phone buzzed with an incoming call labeled Mike. Mildred tapped it swiftly. "Michael? I'm so sorry, dear." Tanya tried to usher the older woman out of the jet bridge, mindful of the next flight's passengers. "Ma'am, you need to step aside. We're boarding. You'll have to handle this call in the waiting area." Mildred placed a hand over the phone's microphone. "Please," she whispered. "I just need a moment." Tanya's patience snapped again. "No, I'm sorry. We can't keep letting you on and off the aircraft. We have policies. You'll have to leave now or I'll have to call security." Mildred's eyes welled with tears. Randall looked alarmed. "Tanya, maybe we can," he started, but Tanya cut him off. "No. She's not cooperating." "Ma'am, I must ask you to leave, or I'll have no choice but to remove you. I'm sorry." With that final statement, Tanya effectively had Mildred escorted from the jet bridge. The older woman broke into quiet sobs. She stumbled, almost losing her balance, and security guards were summoned to guide her away gently. Tanya felt a flicker of guilt, but hardened her expression, telling herself she was just following procedure. She had a new flight to operate, new passengers to serve. Meanwhile, the few travelers who witnessed the scene whispered among themselves, shooting Tanya disapproving looks. Randall, disturbed by Tanya's lack of compassion, shook his head and returned to his post. The immediate aftermath left a sour taste in the air. Barely 2 minutes later, as the last of the new passengers settled, Tanya's phone buzzed with an urgent message from her manager, Marcella. The text read, "Where are you? The CEO is at gate A12 looking for a flight attendant who removed his mother from the plane. Get here ASAP. Tanya stared at the message, her heart pounding. CEO? She typed back, CEO? Whose mother? The response came swiftly, Mrs. Mildred Caldwell. She's Mr. Michael Caldwell's mum. He's outraged. You need to get to the gate, now. Tanya's hand shook. Michael Caldwell was the newly appointed CEO of Horizon Skies Airlines, the same man who had soared up the corporate ranks and, rumor had it, was extremely protective of his family. Realizing the severity of the situation, Tanya abruptly left the new flight in Janelle's care. She rushed down the jet bridge, nerves sizzling. Could the sweet old lady truly be the mother of the CEO? How could that be? She recalled the phone wallpaper. Yes, that man indeed had an air of importance. But Tanya had never met Michael Caldwell in person. She'd only seen his photos in internal newsletters. Reaching gate A12, she spotted a tall, sharp-dressed figure, Michael Caldwell, flanked by Marcella and 2 security officials. And standing beside him, tears on her cheeks, was Mildred. Tanya's stomach dropped. She walked closer, chest tight with dread. Michael Caldwell's eyes were steely, his jaw set. Marcella gestured for Tanya to come forward. Here she is, Marcella said, voice taut. Michael stepped in, voice cold. You're the one who forced my mother off the plane. Tanya opened her mouth, but couldn't form words. She glanced at Mildred, who lowered her eyes in sadness. Marcella filled the tense silence. Mr. Caldwell, let's step away from the crowds. They moved to a quiet corridor. Tanya's mind raced, trying to piece together a defense or some explanation that didn't sound heartless. Standing in a semicircle, Michael Caldwell gently took his mother's hand, then fixed his gaze on Tanya. Would you like to tell me your side? He asked, each word brimming with barely contained anger. Tanya swallowed hard. Sir, your mother left the plane after the flight ended. She came back during boarding for the next flight, trying to retrieve her phone. When we found it, we had to confirm it was hers. Then she refused to leave the jet bridge when asked. We had to maintain safety and protocol, Michael interrupted. Did it ever occur to you that an elderly woman might need a little help and compassion rather than threats of security? His voice rose, startling Tanya. I was on the phone with her, hearing how upset she was. She said you threatened to have her removed as if she were a trespasser. Tanya felt her cheeks burn. I'm sorry, she managed. I had no idea she was your mother. If I'd known, Michael's glare intensified. If you'd known, you would have treated her differently? So, it's acceptable to treat elderly passengers poorly unless they happen to have powerful relatives. Tanya's throat constricted. She could only manage a shaky whisper. It was a misunderstanding. I was under time pressure, dealing with multiple flights. I regret the way it escalated. Mildred spoke up softly, Michael dear. It wasn't all her fault. I was confused, and the situation was complicated. She did find my phone. Michael exhaled, glancing at his mother with tenderness. Mom, you shouldn't have been put through that. My staff is supposed to care for all passengers, especially those who need extra assistance. An uneasy pause lingered. Marcella cleared her throat. Mr. Caldwell, we have protocols for passenger re-entry, but it seems the execution here was less than ideal. Tanya is normally diligent, but clearly something went wrong. Tanya fought tears, feeling the weight of the CEO's fury. She recalled the looks of betrayal in Mildred's eyes. Tanya tried to speak again, voice trembling. I truly apologize, Miss Caldwell. I never wanted to upset you. I was stressed, but that's no excuse. I hope you can forgive me. Mildred's kind eyes locked onto Tanya's. The first forgive you, she said, sincerity in her voice. But I do hope you learn from this. Michael Caldwell rubbed his temples, struggling to remain composed. We've got a serious issue, Tanya. I expect my employees to embody the airline's values. This fiasco can't go unanswered. Corporate will conduct a review. Meanwhile, you're on immediate suspension. Tanya's stomach clenched. Suspension, she closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had worked 8 years for Horizon Skies, building her life around this career. One crucial slip-up, and everything she'd worked for was on a knife's edge. Immediate karma had arrived in the form of the CEO, glaring at her, punishment swiftly following her harsh treatment of his mother. Randall, the gate supervisor, approached from behind. He had witnessed some of the confrontation. Mr. Caldwell, if I might add. I was present when Miss S. Caldwell attempted to retrieve her phone. Tanya was firm, but I also didn't step in strongly enough. I feel partial responsibility. Michael Caldwell looked at him. I appreciate your honesty, but ultimately, Tanya was the flight attendant in charge. My mother was humiliated in front of passengers. My mother, who rarely travels alone anymore, was left in tears. Randall dipped his head. I understand. I just wanted to be transparent. In that moment, Janelle emerged, having hurried over after hearing the commotion. She looked anxiously at the group. Tanya, tear-stained, Michael Caldwell, seething, Mildred, sad but calm, Marcella and security hovering. What can I do to help? Janelle asked quietly. Michael Caldwell glanced at Janelle. Were you on that flight? Did you see how my mother was treated? Janelle took a measured breath. I was, sir. Mrs. Caldwell is a gentle lady. She did need extra assistance, which I tried to provide. Tanya was under pressure, but there were moments she could have shown more compassion. I don't mean to harm my co-worker, but you asked for honesty. Tanya felt the sting of betrayal, but deep down she knew Janelle was right. She had cut corners with empathy. Michael Caldwell's shoulders lowered, and he sighed. I appreciate your honesty, he told Janelle. He then turned back to Tanya. Effective immediately. You will step away from flight duties while an internal investigation takes place. We will contact you with further instructions. Tanya nodded numbly, tears sliding down her cheeks. She realized that no matter how anxious or pressed for time she'd been, she should never have dismissed an elderly passenger in need, especially not in such a harsh manner. Marcella gently motioned for Tanya to hand over her airline ID badge. Tanya complied, her hand trembling as she placed the plastic credential into Marcella's outstretched palm. She had never felt so small, so humiliated. Meanwhile, Michael Caldwell turned to his mother. I'm so sorry you went through this, Mum. Mildred patted his arm. It's all right, dear. It's all a bit overwhelming. I just want to make my connecting flight or find a place to rest. Michael nodded, hugging her gently. I'll arrange a private jet if you like, or at least a direct ticket with all the assistance you need. Mildred shook her head. I don't want to cause more fuss. Just a simple flight to San Francisco. Or, better yet, you can stay with me here a day, and we'll figure it out calmly. Tanya remained rooted to the spot, eyes burning. She witnessed a depth of compassion between Michael and Mildred, a tenderness she had withheld when Mildred needed it most. That pang of regret felt heavier by the second. Marcella placed a hand on Tanya's shoulder. You should go home, she whispered. We'll call you soon. Tanya nodded, turning away, shoulders slumped. She felt stares from all around, some sympathetic, others scornful. She could almost sense the entire airport gossiping about the flight attendant who kicked off the CEO's mum. Her day, her career, her sense of self, everything had crumbled in mere hours. In the days that followed, Tanya's suspension weighed heavily on her. The airline's HR department reached out, scheduling a formal review hearing. Tanya spent sleepless nights replaying the incident, realizing how her tone, her impatience, and her refusal to see Mildred as a vulnerable human being had spiraled into a disaster. Part of her clung to a fragile hope, maybe, just maybe, she could salvage her job if she showed genuine remorse and a plan to improve. Another part feared that the CEO's wrath was too fierce a tide to stem. Meanwhile, Michael Caldwell and Mildred spent a day in Seattle. The local staff arranged a comfortable lounge for Miss S. Caldwell, ensuring she had everything she needed: meals, medical checks, and a direct flight the next morning to San Francisco. Word traveled swiftly through the ranks that the CEO's mother was in town, and employees vied for the chance to make amends. Mildred, gracious as ever, insisted she didn't want a spectacle. She simply craved peace and kindness. Occasionally, she'd mention how she'd prefer not to ruin Tanya's life. She did apologize, Mildred told her son one evening. Michael, still wounded by the ordeal, retorted, but only after the damage was done, and only when she realized who you were. Days later, Tanya arrived at Horizon Sky's headquarters for the hearing. The building's glass facade seemed more imposing than usual. A knot tightened in her stomach as she rode the elevator to the 10th floor, where HR held its reviews. She sat in the waiting room, sweating in her best blazer. Marcella soon appeared, guiding Tanya into a large conference room. Seated at a long table were a panel of executives, including the head of HR, 2 senior managers, and, surprisingly, Michael Caldwell himself, flanked by a quiet Mildred. Tanya's heart hammered at the sight of them. She hadn't expected Mildred to attend. The head of HR began the proceedings by reading out the incident report. Tanya listened, face ashen. Each detail felt like a blow. The abruptness of how she'd handled the phone situation, the humiliation. Mildred endured the threat of calling security. When it was Tanya's turn to speak, she forced herself to meet Michael's eyes briefly, then Mildred's. "I won't deny anything," she said, voice unsteady. "I acted poorly. I lost my patience. I was overwhelmed and let stress blind me. I'm truly sorry." Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I regret it deeply." Mildred exchanged a glance with her son, then spoke softly. "Tanya, I appreciate your apology. I never wanted you to lose your job, but your behavior hurt me at a time I was already scared and confused. I hope you understand that everyone deserves kindness, especially the elderly." Tanya nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Michael Caldwell inhaled sharply. "I want to ensure no other passenger goes through this. Tanya, you're not a bad person, but you failed in your duty. You let the pressure overshadow your empathy." He fixed her with a pointed stare. "If it were up to me alone, you'd be dismissed immediately." Tanya's breath hitched. She clasped her hands together in despair. The head of HR cleared her throat. "Mr. Caldwell, as CEO, your recommendation carries significant weight. However, we also have a progressive discipline policy. We must consider any extenuating factors and the employee's record." Tanya blinked. She had a solid track record prior to this fiasco, albeit with some minor complaints about her abrupt manner. Mildred placed a hand on her son's arm. "Michael, you taught me always to consider second chances. Tanya's behavior was inexcusable, but if she learns from this, perhaps the airline will be better for it." Michael Caldwell looked torn, eyes flicking from his mother to the panel. He exhaled. "All right, I'll respect the process. Tanya, if you remain with Horizon Skies, I expect to see you in a rigorous retraining program, customer care, sensitivity training, conflict resolution, and you'll be on probation for 6 months. One more complaint of this kind, and you're out. Are we clear?" Tanya's heart surged with a spark of hope. "Yes, sir," she whispered, nodding vigorously. "Thank you. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Relief mingled with shame. She would keep her job, but her reputation was in tatters, and she'd have to work diligently to rebuild trust. Over the following weeks, Tanya dove into the retraining program. She attended seminars on assisting elderly and disabled passengers, learned de-escalation techniques for conflicts, and participated in role-playing scenarios to develop empathy. Each day she carried the guilt of how she had treated Mildred. That remorse fueled her determination to improve. Initially, her colleagues viewed her with suspicion. Some had heard the rumor that she nearly cost the airline a public scandal. But as they saw her genuine efforts to change, their attitudes softened. Janelle, who had always been more empathetic, even offered to mentor Tanya in passenger interactions. Meanwhile, Michael Caldwell continued his role as CEO, silently monitoring Tanya's progress. He refused to speak directly with her, preferring to let HR handle updates. Mildred, on the other hand, reached out discreetly. One afternoon, Tanya was surprised to receive a call from the older woman. "I got your number from HR," Mildred explained gently. "I wanted to see how you're doing." Tanya's throat tightened with emotion. "That's very kind, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm doing better. Learning a lot." Mildred's tone was motherly. "I'm happy to hear it. I don't like bearing grudges. I only hope this experience makes you a better flight attendant and a kinder person." The conversation was brief, but it touched Tanya deeply. She realized how gracious Mildred was being, despite the humiliation she had suffered. Spurred by that kindness, Tanya worked harder than ever. She volunteered for extra shifts, assisting wheelchair users and passengers with special needs. Gradually, her new attitude wasn't just an act, it became part of who she was. The tension in her shoulders eased when dealing with difficult passengers. She remembered that each passenger had a story, a worry, or a vulnerability. Instead of bristling, she practiced compassion. After 6 months of probation, Tanya was scheduled for a pivotal evaluation flight to Los Angeles. This flight would determine whether she had successfully completed her disciplinary period. She went through every step meticulously, greeting passengers warmly, helping stow bags, guiding those who needed extra care. The flight went off without a hitch, not a single passenger complaint. In fact, she received 2 commendations from families grateful for her patience. The immediate post-flight meeting with HR was glowing. Tanya was officially off probation, with a note that she'd turned her performance around. Days later, Tanya was summoned to a private meeting with Michael Caldwell. Her stomach fluttered nervously as she walked into his spacious corner office. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic city view, and behind a mahogany desk sat the CEO, posture poised, expression unreadable. Tanya had never been in his office before, though she'd glimpsed it in corporate newsletters. She stood at attention, heart hammering. Michael Caldwell set aside some paperwork and looked up. "Have a seat," he said, voice quiet. Tanya obeyed, smoothing her skirt and bracing for what might come. "I've read the reports," Michael began. "HR indicates you completed the retraining with exemplary feedback. Passengers on your flights have praised your helpfulness and courtesy." He paused, eyes flicking to a framed photo on his desk, one of Mildred smiling in a garden. Tanya noticed the tenderness in his gaze, reminding her of how fiercely he had protected his mother that day. "I'm pleased with your progress," he continued, meeting Tanya's eyes. "You've earned back your position. However, I want you to remember what spurred this change. It wasn't just policy or fear for your job, it was the pain you caused someone who deserved better." Tanya's eyes glistened. "I haven't forgotten, sir. Every day I recall how I treated your mother. It reminds me to do better for all passengers." Michael Caldwell nodded, apparently satisfied. "My mother has also been following your improvement. She told me she called you." Tanya managed a small smile. "Yes, sir. She's been very kind." Michael tapped his pen on the desk. "Let's set up a meeting. My mother would like to see you in person to ensure all is well. She's traveling through Atlanta next month." Tanya swallowed. "Yes, of course. I'd be honored." When the day arrived, Mildred strolled into the Horizon Skies lounge in Atlanta, cane in hand, but with a steady stride. Tanya hurried to greet her, offering her arm. "You look wonderful, Mrs. Caldwell." Mildred grinned. "Thank you, dear. Age might slow me down, but I'm still kicking." They sat together in a private corner, sipping tea. Mildred asked about Tanya's life outside work, her family, her hopes. Tanya opened up, finding the older woman surprisingly easy to talk to. She marveled at how this same woman had once been the object of her impatience. Now they shared an unspoken bond born of a painful lesson and a second chance. By the meeting's end, Mildred took Tanya's hand. "I'm proud of how far you've come," she said, her eyes shining. "I knew from the start you weren't a bad person, just someone who forgot how crucial compassion can be." Tanya felt tears welling. "Your forgiveness has meant everything. I promise to pay it forward." They embraced gently. Around them, passing employees stole glances, recognizing the CEO's mother but seeing, perhaps for the first time, the warmth in Tanya's demeanor. In the following weeks, Tanya received a formal letter from Michael Caldwell's office, commending her transformation and removing the disciplinary note from her file. She nearly cried from relief and gratitude. The letter mentioned that while the airline took passenger mistreatment seriously, it also valued personal growth and rehabilitation. Tanya pinned the letter on her refrigerator at home, an everyday reminder of the day she almost lost everything, and how a second chance had turned her life around. Sometimes, as Tanya walked through the airport terminal, she caught fleeting memories of how she had once hurried past travelers in need, dismissing them as inconveniences. Now, she paused to offer directions, assisted parents with strollers, and greeted even the most difficult passengers with a genuine smile. Her co-workers noticed the shift. Some teased her for becoming too nice, but it was said in jest, with affection. Janelle, in particular, expressed pride, telling Tanya she was an inspiration for new hires who struggled with stress. In a final, unexpected twist, Tanya learned that as part of a new initiative, Michael Caldwell had decided to create a passenger care task force within the airline, a small team dedicated to improving the onboard experience for elderly and special needs travelers. To her shock, HR recommended Tanya as a prime candidate, citing her lived experience in learning from mistakes. Michael Caldwell personally approved her selection. During the first task force meeting, Tanya felt a surge of humility and excitement. She recognized that her darkest moment had become the catalyst for real change, not just in her own conduct, but throughout the airline. On the surface, it was all a neat resolution. Yet deep in Tanya's heart, she knew the real work never truly ended. She needed to remain vigilant, to keep that empathy alive in every flight, every passenger interaction. One slip could send her back into old habits, but with Mildred's gentle voice echoing in her mind, Tanya felt ready to take on the responsibility. She no longer viewed kindness as an option. It was an essential part of her job and her identity. Indeed, flight by flight, day by day, Tanya carried the memory of the elderly lady she once kicked off, who turned out to be the CEO's mum. Immediate karma had come crashing down in a spectacular way, but in the end, it guided her to a new path. She had faced the possibility of losing everything she'd built, only to discover that genuine remorse, humility, and a willingness to grow could yield a second chance. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Every passenger, every co-worker, every stranger crossing her path deserved respect and understanding, no matter who they might be or what hidden connections they held. Thank you for experiencing this dramatic tale of misjudgment, heartbreak, and ultimate redemption. Sometimes it takes a brutal wake-up call to remind us all that compassion should be our first response, not an afterthought. One simple act of impatience set off a whirlwind of consequences, proving that fate and karma can deliver harsh lessons when we forget our basic humanity. If you found this story engaging, please show